Hey everybody, I'm David here. In the unlikely case you want to hang out with me, I'm hosting Co-working Coffee every Wednesday morning. It's for people that work remotely or are allowed to work remotely. It's always a good time. It's at the Lost and Found Cafe in Gastown. And once a month we're also hosting Node School, which usually is the intro to open source. So you'll learn how to get started with open source. Some of the things we've heard today already. Cool. So we're talking about another Node web framework, but I have a slightly different thing I want to cover today. I actually want to see if I'm going to make it to build and deploy this chat application. The reason why I think I might be able to do this is because we're going to be using Feathers. Now, in short, Feathers is a web framework for creating real-time apps and APIs, REST APIs, using JavaScript and TypeScript with Node.JS React Native in the browser. So I got the feel that who here is writing JavaScript regularly? Okay, Node. Not that many Node people. Okay, that's fair. TypeScript? I thought I can do the demos in TypeScript because we're at Microsoft. We'll do it anyway. I hope they're not going to be too involved. Some of that stuff can get a little finicky. Okay, this is basically the same stuff that Fastify does-ish, but the difference with Feathers is that it kind of sits on top of things like Fastify or Koa or Express, which are like lower level HTTP frameworks, and gives you just a different kind of structure to build your application. And how it does that is by using kind of a service-centered approach that makes sure that you don't have to worry about how your services are being accessed. So basically, we have an interface for our APIs already. In JavaScript, it's classes and functions, right? So we shouldn't really have to worry about, is it HTTP? Am I using GraphQL? Is it something totally different? Am I just using it directly? So Feathers abstracts that in a way that you can use many different things like Express or Fastify or Socket.io or GraphQL underneath, but still don't have to change anything in how you build your application, how you structure it, and how it works. And you get a couple of cool things about with this, and I figured the best way to show it is to actually build the chat application, which if you go to the Feathers website at FeathersJS.com, this is pretty small. I'll make it a little bigger. And just you go into the Getting Started guide, you'll see, this is good. This guide will basically give you, what do we need? We need Node.js, Visual Studio, and that's basically it. Show a quick start on how to get started without having to install anything else. And then we'll jump into generating the whole application and building out a couple of things to create our chat. There's two core things about Feathers that are important. The first one is something called services. Basically, it's a CRUD interface that doesn't really, that's like pretty abstracted from the inner protocol that you're using. So we have a find method that gives me all records for messages or users. I can get a single user, I can create a new one. Update and patch. Update means replace a message or user. Patch means just merge new data into the existing one. And then the remove. So it's a pretty basic interface, but it's kind of cool because with this, if you implement our services this way, we can test them without having to spin up anything. We can just say new my service and then call those methods and make sure that they return what we want. And Feathers is taking care of all the stuff underneath of turning it into the API. So for example, this service will be turned automatically in a REST API that lives at a messages endpoint, for example, by mapping these different methods. Like if I say get/messages, then it calls messages.find. If I get messages /1, then it calls that. So each method in here has a direct representation for HTTP, but because this is not specific to requests or responses, we can also expose these through WebSockets. Has anybody used WebSockets for anything other than just, or at all, like real-time updates for websites or APIs-ish? So basically what WebSockets allow us to do is to push messages to the server. There's new things coming up with HTTP 2 and 3 that are going to consolidate a lot of those things, but currently WebSockets are the way to make websites update in real time. What we can also do, however, is call those methods and send messages to the server and get a response back. So a lot of WebSocket protocols actually support sending messages and getting responses back. I did a little bit of a performance comparison of using REST versus like this kind of API. Where is it? There, this one. A REST API versus using WebSockets. And it's about 4 times faster for some cases. Obviously not every case, but just by changing the protocol, you can get like a 4 times performance improvement. And when using this interface and this service, we didn't have to change anything. Everything just still worked exactly the same. Oopsie. All right, so we have our service, but sometimes we have things that don't necessarily fit in here, or that you want to do for every service. Say we have a messages and a user service. We have things like logging. Like we don't want to have to write this every time in each one of those methods. So this in Feathers is called hooks. In Node, this is referred to as middleware, but it's a pretty common pattern in saying we want to register some functionality before or after a method runs. In Java and C# is aspect-oriented programming. It has a ton of different names. Middleware is kind of the Node name. It's called in Feathers. It was called that before React hooks, but it's all the same idea. It's saying, well, before find or get or create, I want to be able to modify the data before it's saved to the database. I want to log the user or make sure that the user is allowed to do a certain thing. Or even things that don't belong to, say, a messages service, right? Like I don't want to have in the code of my message service itself, want to have a notification that somebody sent me a message to send out as an email. I can do that in a hook and just register it dynamically after a message has been created. And logging and profiling, pretty helpful too. They look fairly straightforward in Feathers. You basically get a context object. It's an asynchronous function, and the context object basically has like data, params, ID. That's the most important ones actually. And then I can just say, okay, add a created add property before it's saved to the database. Another neat thing about services is what you would do is you go in and make your database calls in those methods. Now, the functionality is pretty much the same for all most endpoints. So Feathers has a whole bunch of services that provide a collection of this functionality for you already, so you don't have to write these yourself over and over and over again. Anybody who has written get and post handlers that do the same thing many, many times over again probably knows how annoying this can become. Here, let's look at some code. Okay, I'm going to make this one bigger too. Right, so I am going to use TypeScript. It's almost like JavaScript, except with types, which, like Lueke hinted at, actually can be quite useful in the long term. So this is, if you want to follow the guide, this is the quick start. But I installed all the dependencies and everything already. So in the quick start, what we're going to do is we'll just create a simple messages service, create a Feathers app, and then run a couple commands. So in this case, we have our message that has an ID and a text, and a message class where we return all our messages, which is an array. and we're allowed to create new messages. This ID thing is basically like, because we can't delete messages, we'll just add a counter of the message length, and then we push the message. The next important step is to create the Feathers application and register this messages service. So we say, okay, this is on the messages name or path is a new messages service. And then we can get that service that we just registered and say, hey, when something has been created, it's a new message, log it to the console. So this is something that you get automatically already without having to do it yourself. You get like a notification on every time something has been created, updated, patched, or removed. And then we'll grab the same service again and create 2 items, and then log all the messages. Now, I mean, this is going to be very surprising what's going to happen here. If we run this with TypeScript, we can see that it logged that the first message has been created and the second, and then it logs all the messages. Now, the only thing that I'm going to do here quickly is add a hook to this messages service to show you how we can like put things together dynamically. The example that I'm going to use here is, okay, add a hook before the create method, and it takes it's an async function, it takes the context, and because we use TypeScript, we have to say this is a hook context. And then we can just say context.data.text. We'll just add like 2 exclamation marks at the end. And if we run it again, you can see that, well, each entry that got added has 2 exclamation marks at the end. We could use this to send emails and all of those things. Cool. This is not doing that much yet, and it's not even an API. But that's the beauty about this, because Feathers does all of that stuff for you automatically. And there's a couple of other things to wire everything up, which is where the command line tools come in handy. So if we jump into my Feathers chat repository, you can go on the Feathers docs guide. This is the generating an app. So you can actually just install the command line tools, which will generate an application for you, create the folder, and then just say, I installed a bunch of this stuff already, so you don't have to listen or watch me install stuff. So we can say Feathers generate app. You can pick which language. It will ask you a whole bunch of things, like I want the REST API and the real-time API. Testing framework. I prefer low-level, simple stuff as well in JavaScript. One of the more basic ones is tape, or Lueke said, or Mocha. We want authentication, so it does a lot of this stuff for you automatically already. A pretty common one is saying, okay, I want users to sign up with a username and a password, but you can also add a whole bunch of different strategies like GitHub. I don't know if you'll have time to add this, because setting the app up on GitHub always takes a little bit of time, but maybe we get to it. I'd rather look at like if you can get it deployed with username, password, login. Basically, what you can do is confirm everything just with enter, and then it'll download and install a couple of things for you. Here it's complaining because I already have it ran this before, and you can start the application right away. And then you'll see that it already runs on our local host. If we go to, for example, the user's endpoint, which is generated automatically because we added authentication, we get an error because we're not allowed to access it. We can also run tests automatically, which is kind of nice and very important. It hasn't been done in JavaScript as much as we all wished for. It's getting much better, but please add tests. I can say from empirical research that projects without tests actually tend to fail, are much more likely to fail for technical reasons. And doing it later in the game is a lot more of a pain. So it sets up some basic tests for you and like your basic service, the user service. Now, the next step is to generate another service. That one I can actually run. So we have initialized our app, and then we can just say, okay, we'll want to create a new endpoint. And here you can see a lot of the different databases. It sets a lot of them up for you. You can always implement your own, but these are the pre-done one, like MongoDB, Mongoose. SQLize is an ORM for Node that uses Postgres and MS SQL. This is a more low level. So there's a whole bunch of different choices. I like to use this one, which is just using a file system database because we don't have to install a database server. And then for, well, our chat app, we want a messages endpoint. Should be registered at the messages path. We need authentication because we want to attach a user that is logged in with the message. And then it generates all of this stuff, which is actually not that much. I don't know if we'll have time for it, but a lot of the code is not, it just makes sure that it's all split up into individual files. So you can see here is our messages service, and it's basically just an empty class. Like, remember how we created the messages class before? In this case, we just extend from the database, so it gives us all the create, read, update functionality automatically already. We don't have to do anything to make that happen. We can, however, customize that behavior. So one way to do that is to use this extended service and override one of the existing methods. For example, one thing that would be useful for our chat would be to show a user image. There is a website called Gravatar where you can register your email address and upload your face. And then everybody who has your email address can get an avatar of your face. So this is basically what we're doing here. Whenever a new user is created, we'll get the email, the password, the GitHub username or ID from our data, create the avatar URL, which is just a hash of the email address, not super important, and then basically assemble our new user data with the avatar, and then call the original database and say, okay, please write it to the file on MongoDB or Postgres or whatever you want to use. Well, I should probably use TypeScript because we already started. Okay. This show is also called Dave copy and pasting code for an hour. Basically programming. So there's also a development mode, which is kind of nice because it restarts every time we change our files, so we don't have to do that manually ourselves. And I think now we can create a new user. Are you familiar with like how to use REST APIs? Who's used Postman before? Curl, maybe? So basically, that's the main goal of Feathers API, is to create JSON APIs that you can call and get JSON back. And we can, some of the tools, I was going to do it with curl, but I guess let's use Postman. We can create a new user if it starts. I'm going to make it bigger too. We can create a new, so we'll build a website in a second that allows us to create new users. But for now, let's actually just try and create one from the command line. Still small. Can everybody read that? Cool. So we need to set content type and accept headers, and then we'll just say, okay, email is this one and password, so I'm posting the JSON body and see what happens. Oh, okay, well, never mind. I've already tried this, so I'm going to remove my data because we don't need them right now. I was like, oh, the first thing I'm going to run is already going bad, but we'll be okay. Okay, so here you can see it created the user, it added the avatar URL, and then it created like a random ID. It also created a password internally. Remember, we posted this with a password, but we don't want anybody to ever see this. It is hashed, so it's still difficult to crack, but you still don't want to expose hash passwords either. So we created this user, and if we want to log this user in, we can just say because during the app, when we generated it, it asked if we want to authenticate. We can just say, okay, we now post to the authentication endpoint using the local strategy. So local strategy means username and password, and then I also got to pass username, well, here it's called email and password. If I do this, I actually get back an access token that I can use to make API requests to other endpoints, like messages. So this is how I can use the API with any REST client. The interesting thing about Feathers is that, like I mentioned before, it also has a socket API, and that socket API you can use the same way through the Feathers app as the application that we built previously as an example. I don't have it open anymore. The app that we just did where we created a couple messages. So you can create the same app on the client, tell it to talk to your server, and call the same methods, and it'll just direct everything to the server. So you don't have to make custom requests or any of that stuff. You can use the app on the browser or React Native in the same way as you can on the server. But if there's an Android client or an iOS client, you can still use the API directly. Cool. Making good time. If you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt, because I know I sometimes tend to be a little too fast. Okay. We have an API. We have customized our user's service. We got to do two more things, which is create two hooks to basically process new messages. So for the user service, we overrode the create method. For processing the messages, we're just going to look at how some of this customization can be done using a hook. We do this by basically calling feathers. Let's go small again. Generate hook. And if I actually type I'm tethering right now, so this might be a little slow. So what we do in this hook is we'll basically look at the logged in user. Remember, we created a token that we send with requests, and that token identifies the user. So if I log in with my email and my password, I get back a token, and if I send that token with any API request, it will automatically set params.user to that user that is logged in. So we can actually grab that user in our hook and say, well, let's do two things. One, make sure that the text isn't too long so people can spam our chat. And then also make sure that the user is associated with the message. So grab the user from parameters and associate it with that message. And then also add a created at, which shows when the message was sent. All right, feathers generate hook, still too small again. So we wanted to call it, if you look here, process message, we'll run it before a message is created, and then it just wrote that file for us in right here. We'll overwrite this with the TypeScript version of what I just went through. So in this case, again, get the user, attach the user, add the user ID, and a created app. This also makes sure that people can put junk into it, because AnyDB is a NoSQL database. So we're actually sanitizing that only this data is being put in there. This is where schema come in handy, or a SQL database that would actually yell at you. I would recommend using one of the SQL ORMs when you're using Node.js. Cool. So this has been updated. If you quickly look in here, we can see that this process message hook has been added to the before create. So it'll run every time somebody creates a message. Now we associated the user ID, and the other thing we want to do because it's a NoSQL database, we can't necessarily include it yet right away. We'll just populate the user manually afterwards. Now there's ways to optimize this, but this is a good example on how to do that manually. So we'll just run the same command again and say, okay, populate user in a message. So this one will run after, because we want to look at an existing message and then add the user after it's been returned from the database. And then again on the messages service, and this will run, let's double check, on everything, because we want to include the user information for a message everywhere. Cool. So let's briefly look at it. Populate user. I'm going to copy and paste this over again. Basically what we do here is we have an add user function that adds the user to a message. And how it does that is it actually looks at the Feathers application that you have in the context, gets to the user service, it's just like the messages service, and gets that user's content for that user ID. You get back a user object, and then we'll just merge that together with our existing message and update the data that we want to return. Okay, this is all the code. It was a little quick. You can, there's a little more detailed description in the guides as well. Just want to get to the deployment because I'm curious if it's going to work. Okay, so we briefly looked at how to authenticate users already. We can already create new messages. We got an authentication token and all of those things. Here's an example for how to use Feathers in the browser. So basically there's a version of Feathers that is built for the browser. You can use the Feathers itself for the browser too. Only through plugins it's being turned into a client or a server. And what we do is we'll use Socket.io, which is probably the most common Node WebSocket library, initialize a new Feathers app, configure the Socket.io plugin that basically makes sure that, okay, if I want to talk to a server, talk to it through this one socket here. And then we'll just, there's an authentication plugin, because WebSocket authentication is something I'm not going to get into. It's a lot more difficult than HTTP request authentication to make sure that reconnections and all those things work. The client is taking care of a lot of this for you. And then we can basically say, okay, just authenticate and log in with the strategy and the password. And once that is successful, we can make authenticated requests. Now this is where the front end comes in, because we actually need that code if we want to build the front end and build the chat application. I wanted to do this with React, but I'm tethering, and create React app is 300 megabytes of things. So I'm just going to use good old JavaScript, which we haven't seen in a while. So there's Feathers works with any framework on the client side, just because it's the things that I already showed you. So you can integrate it with Redux, React. There's a good Vuex integration for Vue.js. But it doesn't really matter. You can use all of that with any framework. And the example for the front end here is using good old plain JavaScript, which I'm not going to go through all of it, but maybe through some of the interesting parts. So we'll update the front page to make it look pretty, so load some CSS. We'll load the Feathers client build, Socket.io, and an app.js, which I already copied and pasted in here. And what the app.js does is basically, we looked at it briefly before, initialize the Feathers app and socket connection, because now what we can do here is basically say client service messages create text hello. So this is how easy. No HTTP requests, no nothing. You just, it does all of those things for you. There's a whole bunch of boilerplate in here. HTML to show the login page, HTML to show the chat messages. This is a method that adds a single user. See, it was like good HTML, no virtual DOM and nothing. Here it adds a new message. And then we'll do the login and showing the chat. So there's two ways this can go, right? The one is, okay, I'm already logged in. I'll just show the chat page. The other side is, okay, I'm not logged in. I got to show this login/sign up page. We were kind of lazy. It's doing both. And a lot of this is boilerplate for event handlers, click handlers. But you can see right here, you see the message. So we say client service messages create from the input value when you press the enter button. And then what we do when a message is created, we call render a new message. And when a user is created, so when somebody signs up, we want them to show in the user list too. This is not showing them as online, offline yet. There's a little more details in there. But this is the basic idea of our front end. And if it's still running, which it looks like it is, we should be able to just go to localhost 3030. And this is the login or sign up page. So you can put in your email or password and then say login, sign up and login, or login with GitHub. We haven't configured GitHub yet, but it's kind of cool because you just have to drop in your like application key and secret and then click on it and it'll create a GitHub user. Maybe you have time for it. Making good time. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just sign up and log in with a new user. And we can already see here that the user that we remember how we created this one through Postman. So that user is still here. And we're already able to send messages to ourselves, which is kind of sad. Which is why I wanted to get into the deployment and see if we can actually get this running on Azure and chat together, because that's when it starts making sense. So yeah, which is why I was running a little quick. So we have, I think, 10-ish more minutes. So what I'm going to try and do, and I set this up this morning, and I was grumbling over the Azure deploy because it wasn't working. And then it turned out that I forgot to actually compile the application. So please remind me to compile the application before I deploy it, and hopefully it'll run. So I signed up for free this morning and set up this repo. And there's two things that I have to do in my app which are totally fair and not Microsoft's fault. One is I'm not allowed to write to the file system, which makes sense. So we can't use this database that writes to the file system. Luckily, they have a in-memory only flag. This is definitely not production ready. You don't want to run a database in memory only. But let's see if this works and what we can do with it. And we set the same flag for our messages service. Come on. All right. Now, I have to compile, npm run compile, because TypeScript, which is also going to take a little bit. And I think that was everything we needed to deploy, so I'm just going to try deploy to web app. This might take a little bit, so I'm happy to take any questions if anything was a little too fast, which it might have. Or yes, please.
Sorry for my English. Under your intro, the egg box feature, there's a word I want to know my English. Sanitize.
Which one?
Sanitize.
Oh, it's like making sure that there isn't any invalid data, or just processing it so that it's, sometimes you want to make sure it's not too long, it doesn't contain swearing, or you want to make sure sanitizing, for example, too, is if people try and do the weirdest things on the web, make sure to escape HTML before you put it into the database. That's basically the process of sanitizing it. There's a little thing here. It's called escape. So basically, you can see here it just replaces every greater and smaller and sign with the HTML equivalent, because otherwise people could come and write a chat message loading a script tag and execute code on other people's computers. So that's the process of sanitization. Yeah, exactly. No. Yeah, exactly.
Sorry,
this is
David?
the first thing people will try, yeah.
Sorry, could you just, when your questions come in, please repeat them?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
And just letting you know, you've got time, like you've got 15 minutes, so.
Cool. So then we can still do GitHub login, maybe. Okay. So again, the question was what sanitization is. In the context of web applications, it's usually making sure that people don't put invalid data into the database, or you change them before you render them to the user. Otherwise, somebody will most definitely try to sign up with script tags in the email address and things like that. Very bad for security. So that it's a pretty important process. Okay, so it looks like that deployment was completed. I think I deployed it to Feathers Chat, AsiaWebsites.net. This is further than I got so far, so this is a good sign. I'm going to just sign up and log in and see what happens. Okay, so if anybody wants to join, you can go to feathers-chat at AsiaWebsites.net. So this is obviously not super production ready yet. It's running in memory, and we're not doing any email verification and things like that. But you're not allowed to put images in. So that's handled already. But if anybody wants to join, you should see in real time how people are signing up and how they're sending messages. And if we had like an Android app, we could use the REST API to connect to it and send messages and sign up, things like that. Emojis are working too, which is awesome. Like, I've never tried that. This is very cool. Okay, so this is always the fun part about this. I appreciate Microsoft Azure was actually very, very nice to deploy to. You would connect this to a database eventually, but this is the first time I actually deployed it other than a Heroku demo years ago. If you still have time and nobody else has any questions, I'm going to just try and see if we can get the GitHub login working. The process or the protocol Google, Twitter, Facebook, and everybody else is using to allow the sign-in with XYZ is called OAuth. It is a rather tricky process at times, but Feathers on the client has a lot of things built in to make that a little easier. So ideally, we should only have to add our client secret and ID. So let's see if we can get it. I'm going to go back to the guide because I didn't know I would get that far, which is nice. GitHub log. Okay, so we'll create a new OAuth application on GitHub. I'm going to make this bigger again. We'll call this Feathers Chat MS. What was the homepage? Cool, this one. I'm also seeing that only one person has their gravatar. I think that's like a Web 2.0 kind of thing. We should probably use like the GitHub avatar or something. Feathers Chat application running on Azure. And then we need a callback. So the one for testing locally is this, right? But for the production version, we actually need to use our website. And then it goes to OAuth GitHub callback, register the application. I don't know if it needs to be verified. Actually, I should have maybe checked that, but we'll just try it. So we'll have client ID. We'll copy that in. You can steal that one too. We have the client secret. And when we're done, we're redirecting back to the home page, which is where our front end is running. Right? Cool. So this is all good to go. This is also good to go. Now the one thing we have to do, remember how when we edited the user service, which is hiding right here, services, users class, we need an email. If you don't do an email, it would basically blow up here. So if you log in with GitHub, you don't get the email until you update the login mechanism. Feathers uses a so-called strategy, kind of like other authentication libraries. And in this case, we're basically making our own OAuth strategy that grabs the email from the profile because we don't save it to the database by default. So I'm going to have to add this, and I should just start copy and pasting the TypeScript version of this. So we'll have to add this to the authentication.js file. All of this, by the way, is documented in the API docs, which Feathers is like 7-8 years old now. So there was a lot of growing that happened there. You can, what we learned today already, leave a comment or edit this page, which is true. People are very, very good at editing and contributing to documentation pages. I unfortunately don't have the writing staff of Microsoft to keep the docs up to date. So we'll have to balance the user contribution and keeping the docs as short and concise as possible a little bit more aggressively, unfortunately. But it has all the parts documented. What we're touching right now is the authentication part. So I'm going to copy and paste the GitHub strategy. We probably have to import all of this stuff. Sure. And then the OAuth strategy. And then this. Should have just copy and pasted the whole thing. Actually, yeah. Let's copy and paste the whole thing. There's even a copy and paste button here. Okay, so what we're doing is we're just extending the data we get back for that users with the profile email. GitHub does give us the email. We just want to store it to the database as well. And then we say, okay, register the GitHub strategy so that we can actually call the OAuth flow. This should be everything we have to do on the server. The only way we know it'll work is by doing it in prod, which is always a great idea. Much like live coding. Nothing ever goes wrong. Okay, let's deploy this again. It's gotten much faster too. And I just realized that I might have forgotten one thing, which is to log in with GitHub. Oh no. So basically, when you log in with GitHub, what you do is you create a link to initiate the login flow, and that redirects you to GitHub, asks you for permissions, and I was going to say, can I like put the thing down or something? People are getting like blinded. I was like, I thought it was the brilliance of this code, but I'm pretty sure it's the sun. So what you do is you follow this URL. Thank you. Appreciate it. So you follow this URL. It redirects you to GitHub, asks you for permissions, and then redirects back to the application. Browse website. Open link. So the thing is, right now, I'm still logged in. So my access token is valid for 1 day. So I'm still logged in. I got to sign out first. And I think the problem I'm going to have is that my user already exists. So we'll see what happens, because I think it might just complain. So if somebody with a GitHub account that has not signed up yet wants to try it, but let's try if you can log it. So it asks us, okay, we want to authorize this application. Cool, I authorize this application. We'll get bounced back. And I got an error because my email address already exists, and I sucked at handling errors. So if somebody with a GitHub account would like to sign up with GitHub and an email that is not in the system yet, that would be much appreciated. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. I think we lost everybody who signed up so far too, because we're only running in memory. So I apologize if it says, no, I wasn't everything, my life sucks. That was the error. So I think part of the problem is now too, because the user information isn't persisted, it lost all the user information. So even if you're still logged in, it's going to be like, I don't know this user. I think, note for next time, I'm really happy with how this went, use a database that's more persistent, because you get all kinds of problems. They're really nice for testing, though, because you can just blow it away every time you run your tests. And that's something I quickly wanted to show in setting up a Feathers test environment. We can basically just load the application and then call our service the way, making sure that it returns the things that we expect, which is kind of nice because we don't have to fake requests. We don't have to start a server or anything. You just get the Feathers app and run it and run your test. Okay, I apologize that the last step didn't work. It was the only thing I didn't test because I wasn't sure if I was going to get that far. But I appreciate everybody signing up and sending messages. So hopefully for next time we'll have a more persistent version of this. Thank you. Any more questions? Otherwise, we'll have a longer break. Thank you. Thanks.
I've seen you building an API for a company, and for the API development, how easy would it be to hook into like Azure AD for credential management?
There was somebody. So the question is how to hook into other authentication systems. There was a lot of back and forth because there is a pretty popular authentication system called Passport.js and Node.js. The problem is it's not really maintained that much anymore, and because there's a lot of different strategies, everybody's doing things a little differently. So it was a real pain to integrate that with a lot of the socket stuff and things like that. You are still able, because Feathers also integrates with Express, you're still able to integrate the passport strategy into the whole flow. The new way for doing it from a Feathers perspective to create strategies that work more seamlessly with WebSockets and everything would be to implement your own. There is unfortunately not one that integrates Azure AD yet, so the best options would be to, what is there to integrate that? Node.js, Azure, AD, right? Using any of the existing ones and then integrating it. So, oh wait, it's LDAP, right? It's LDAP compatible. Okay, there's an authentication LDAP plugin that you can just add. Basically the same way what we did with GitHub. You just instantiate your LDAP strategy and then give it all the info that it needs. There was some with Amazon Incognito, but the node integration for those was not, isn't there at all yet. So there's definitely a little bit of manual steps involved, or potentially in some of those things. But there is a system to handle it.
Any other questions? All
Cool.
right.
Yeah. Check it out. Visit me on Wednesday mornings, or if you have any questions, you can create issues. You can just talk to me later. Yeah, always around. Oh yeah, wait. Nope, this crashed. I wanted to give you my contact info. Just that would probably help, right? 1 sec. I don't know why my it's DAFFL on GitHub and Twitter, and then you can go to the FeathersJS GitHub. We usually read our issues. All right, thanks.
Fantastic. And you're going to be around for the panel at 4:30?
Yes.
Awesome.
Exactly.
Great. Thank you so much, David. Okay.
Thank you.